and political science to give its, oh, it's really quite exciting, the London School of Economics and Political Science to give it its full name. You may be wondering how I got involved with the iASPIRE series of workshops. So I've visited ISBF in pre-COVID times on numerous occasions in my capacity as Associate Academic Director of the University of London programs, which are taught at ISBF. Indeed, if you see our little logo at the bottom right of the screen, such that a little bit of soft selling here, ISBF runs various undergraduate programs and graduate diplomas in the fields of economics, management, finance, and the general social sciences, and also specific courses looking at data science and business analytics. So my background, so I aspired myself once upon a time to go off into financial services sector and make my fortune that way. And when I was many years ago looking through the various job adverts for sort of quantitative analysts, be it at investment banks, hedge funds, etc., basically a prerequisite for those sorts of roles with almost telephone number salaries, meaning that there were lots of zeros on the end of it, which sounded quite appealing, was to get a PhD in a quantitative field. So I thought, okay, I'll do a PhD in statistics, and I enrolled at the LSE to do that. However, during my time as a PhD student, to make ends meet, would do some tutorial classes of undergraduates. And doing so, I discovered teaching for the first time, and I really sort of fell in love with teaching as a profession. So I finished the PhD, and then someone in my department retired and I needed a job. And then I became a lecturer in the same department and have been there ever since. So just a broad words of advice about careers. I mean, you're all very young, and some of you may have a very clear trajectory in mind, and you're resolute on a particular industry or maybe even employer that you aspire to work for. However, life can be somewhat unpredictable, and had you asked me 15, 20 years ago, if I would have gone into academia, I doubt I would have answered in the affirmative. So there can be these sorts of aspects of chance or serendipity, and you can't necessarily predict exactly the pathways that your careers will follow. Indeed, I mean, the pandemic, from a career perspective, has this fundamentally and sort of permanently change the world of work. We're meeting via Zoom, and maybe 18 months ago, had you heard of Zoom, let alone used it, and now you're probably Zoom pros. So while, of course, some job roles by necessity would have to be in person, we can perhaps anticipate a great deal of remote working, if not on a full-time basis, at least perhaps partly going forward. So I've been involved with summer school online education. So LSE used to be exclusively an offline institution, but even just before the pandemic raged, LSE started to dabble in the world of online education, be it at the executive level, aimed at sort of working professionals with short online courses, and we've been really expanding our provision quite aggressively in that field. Consultancy, so yes, I lecture at students. I dabble in ad hoc projects on a consultancy basis for a range of industries. Personally, I find that quite an interesting part of my perhaps sort of portfolio career, whereby I get to work on real world problems in various industries. And a couple of examples. One was the art market, and you may wonder what the link is between sort of statistics and art. Well, the thing about art is that it's quite difficult to value. So while we now have crypto art and these NFTs, these non-fungible tokens, some of them selling for like millions of pounds or millions of, perhaps paid in Bitcoin rather than sort of normal currencies. But if one thinks about like a Picasso on your wall, if you were lucky enough to own an original, what is that actually worth? And the trouble is with art, as these are like non-fungible tokens, remember they are sort of like a digital sort of unique certificate of authenticity. So while these NFT artworks are clearly reproducible in almost infinite form, and anyone can download one of those sorts of digital works of art, there's only actually one unique official certificated owner. Now, perhaps the jury is still out whether those NFTs themselves have any sort of real useful value other than perhaps bragging rights. I think Sir Tim Berners-Lee recently sold for charitable, raising money for charity, I believe, but his initial code for the internet a few days or a couple of weeks ago. So whoever actually bought that, the code, I mean, anyone can access that code, but perhaps it's more just for bragging rights that you actually own it. So just briefly on that art market project, looking at sort of creating ways of valuing art, effectively coming up with art price indices. So just as you have stock indices like the FTSE 100 in the UK, the Sensex, if I'm not mistaken, in India, likewise, you could come up with like an art 100 index to look at sort of the market value of the leading 100 artists, be they dead or alive, most of them dead. But that's somewhat subjective about what art is worth, and so you could look at auction house hammer price data, such that on a particular day that specific Picasso or Van Gogh or whoever sold for a particular amount, and then try and extrapolate from that sort of the sort of brand value of a particular artist. World Gold Council, that was a fun one a few years ago. I went to the World Gold Council offices in London. They're basically the market development body for the world gold industry. So sort of the representatives of that, they're looking at the mining companies, but also the users of gold. So in India, for example, gold heavily employed in jewelry, also industrial manufacturing. Your phones, computers will have some traces of gold in there. And the thing about gold is that no one knows exactly how much there is, nor who owns it. Central banks will have considerable reserves, but there will be a lot in the private sector. There'll be the sort of underground economy in terms of gold. So in terms of sort of supply and demand, there's huge uncertainty about the amount there is and who has it, which makes pricing gold quite challenging. Perhaps after this session, you can do a quick internet search for the current gold price, per ounce of gold, what is it selling for? But price broadly, an economist would say, resolves these demand-supply dilemma in the marketplace. But if there's uncertainty about perhaps supply, how much gold there is, and indeed no one knows for sure how much has already been extracted from the ground, it makes the pricing of gold quite challenging. And so a data-based consultancy project was trying to merge different sets of estimates about quantities of gold out there. But focusing a bit more perhaps on data science itself. So our session format, I'm giving a talk really on aspects of data science. What is a data scientist? What kinds of skills should budding data scientists acquire? Thinking about possible jobs in this particular arena, but very much an opportunity for Q&A. It's perhaps easiest to put any questions in the chat, and we'll try and leave a few minutes towards the end, and I'll happily field them. So. In 2019, I don't have 2020 data, I've not been easily able to source it, but I think this will serve as a good starting point, just to give a sense about the volume, the quantity of data out there. So 2019, perhaps an appropriate year to look at rather than 2020, as this was our sort of last pre-COVID full year. Just to give you a sense that in every single minute of every day in 2019, and I don't need to read off all of those figures to you, but just to give you a sense about, in terms of digital data, how much was being generated. Now, while we don't have, or I don't have at least 2020 data to hand, I think what has COVID shown us from a data perspective, clearly this has accelerated the previous trend about moving into the digital sphere, and not at any particular country, but at a global level. As soon as lockdowns rolled out around the world, when we were all forced to stay at home, we were forced really to do a lot of our shopping online. Now, while perhaps some of you already shopped online pre-COVID, perhaps people of older generations were perhaps more used to doing sort of shopping in physical stores. Yet out of necessity, people have had to adapt to an online life, and one might expect that at least some of these new habits are perhaps more long-lasting. So there's no shortage of data. And fun fact, it's been estimated that in the last 2 or 3 years, more data have been generated and recorded digitally than in the rest of human history combined. It's an estimate, but I don't think it's far off. Now, I find that a staggering statistic. Now, I'm not sure exactly where you are in your respective educational career paths, but let's suppose you are imminently about to start your university studies. So in the UK, UK degree, standard degree takes 3 years. So when I have my first lecture to my LSE undergraduate students, I'll tell them that if you imagine all of the data ever recorded throughout all of human history up till the present moment in time, i.e. their first lecture with me, fast forward 3 years to their graduation, between now and then, approximately that volume again of data would have been generated. So there's no shortage of data. However, there is, I'd like to think, a critical shortage of people who are able to make sense of that data. Now, The Economist magazine speculated, I think on a cover 2 or 3 years ago, whether data is the new oil. I say data is, we could say whether data are. Is data a singular or plural noun? I think a Latin scholar would strictly say it's a plural noun, but often it's used in the singular form. Now, I love analogies, and they're great for teaching, but analogies are rarely perfect. So they pose the question, is data the new oil? So if one thinks about, let's say, volume, quantity, I think the analogy is very poor in that clearly there's a finite amount of oil out there. Yes, perhaps new reserves of oil are discovered periodically, but nonetheless, there's a certain amount under the ground ultimately to be extracted. And perhaps one hopes the world is transitioning more to a greener economy in the years and decades ahead. But I think oil will be with us at least for some time to come. So there, the analogy I think is very poor because data is for practical purposes near infinite. But where I think the analogy is extremely good is when we consider the issue of refinement. In that, imagine the crude oil, the stuff you extract from the ground. In its unrefined form, crude oil has very limited value. It's only once you've put it through the oil refinery and converted it into practical uses, such as jet fuel, gasoline, petrol, whatever, that's when there's real value added. And likewise with data, data in its raw form, to go back to the various uploads to YouTube, Google searches, etc. In its unrefined form, the data itself is perhaps of limited value. It's only when we go through this process of refinement. So this pyramid on screen, it's somewhat old, but in terms of concept, but I think is still highly relevant for today. And broadly, what data scientists really seek to do is to convert the raw data, which will contain a lot of noise, and perhaps most of those data in that minute being collected, perhaps a large majority of it won't be of any practical use. But within it, if we were to mine that data, there would hopefully be some sort of gold nuggets or diamonds. And our goal really is to refine the raw data into what we'll call information from which we can derive knowledge and hopefully thereafter wisdom to assist in our decision making. So in terms of careers, okay, we'll have a data science theme here, but many of you, perhaps your interests lie elsewhere. The world is forever changing, and I think COVID has shown us that we are entering a world of accelerated change. So the world has always changed. The various industrial revolutions and the uses of horses to cars, et cetera, et cetera. Change has always been around, but perhaps the rate of change is really accelerating. So you're young, and one needs to be mindful to prepare for the jobs of the future, not the past. So looking at a sort of data analyst, data scientist theme, so I was just sort of looking through various jobs boards, and there's various organizations like World Economic Forum, etc., who will routinely produce sort of top 10 lists of sort of skills being required. So these are at the present, but I don't see much likely change in these in the foreseeable future, so for at least the near future. So from a sort of data scientist perspective, what kinds of specialized skills, baseline skills, credentials might one require? Well, I won't go through every single one. I'll perhaps just highlight a few, and in particular, some which are perhaps related. And I'm going to be brave and try and annotate on screen live. So I'm going to focus on the baseline skills first of all, and number one, they're communication skills. So when one thinks about a data scientist, perhaps there's a perception that it's sort of all about programming, building algorithms and doing number crunching. Admittedly, that's a major component, but by no means is it collectively exhaustive. And I think one area which is often neglected is the importance of communication skills, which I'm actually going to link to presentation skills. And for this, one may wish to consider what we call data visualization, or data viz for short. Effectively, storytelling, bringing data to life, for which one very popular form of software is something called Tableau, you can see also featuring under the specialized skills as well. Now, not to say this is exclusively what one needs, but it's often an area which I feel is neglected, and something where you can, I think, make a head start for yourselves. Such that Tableau is a widely used in academia, but in the corporate sector as well, data visualization tool, which enables you to hone your presentation skills and ultimately communicate interesting trends, patterns, and relationships between things. I'll perhaps give you a very brief demo of Tableau a little bit later, time permitting. But please don't forget Microsoft Excel. While it's perhaps not the most sophisticated sort of statistical econometric software package out there, the use of Excel is pretty much ubiquitous. And if you just want to do some sort of playing around with some data, being able to build some simple, indeed quite complex spreadsheet models can be quite valuable. In terms of sort of programming languages, learning or improving your coding skills, one can see Python appearing. That's quite easy to pick up in a sort of self-study way, as I would say is Tableau, indeed Microsoft Excel, and VBA in there as well. Lots of free online courses, MOOCs, etc. And I would, I'll be perhaps biased in my view here, but I think improving your computing skills while you can take formal courses in this, I think a lot of this is trial and experimentation, and you'll like learning a foreign language. Yes, you can have courses in it, but it's really for you to immerse yourself in a new foreign language and practice it, and practice makes perfect. And I think broadly, one can say somewhat analogously for software. Related to Python is something called R, a popular programming language, particularly in academia, but also a bit in industry as well. Are perhaps slightly more challenging to master than Python. So depending on your coding abilities, if you're a real beginner, perhaps Python is a good starting point. But if your CV mentioned R as well, while not listed in these top 10 lists, I think from a signaling perspective, it would look quite impressive to a prospective employer. Now, the challenge with when one is learning software is how you demonstrate proficiency. And while you can take sort of certificated courses or tests in Excel, Tableau, etc., and of course, other things equal, a good thing to do. Similarly, with foreign languages, how would you demonstrate your proficiency? I think most people on a CV would self-classify their proficiency in a foreign language, as in they would claim that it's either their mother tongue, that they are fluent, they are an intermediate user, speaker, reader of said language, or perhaps a beginner or a working knowledge. And perhaps similarly for software programs, one may do a sort of self-classification of one's ability. And then it's up to you to perhaps justify your self-classification that you are a novice or intermediate or expert user of some software. So keep in mind that it's about skills, and while the in-demand skills do change over time, I think in the sort of data science sphere, everything you see listed here will have some longevity. So what is a modern data scientist? Now, this is somewhat, don't think I mean to sort of stereotype a data scientist as a sort of a white male there. Just think of that as a caricature, a somewhat thinner version of me. But clearly it is an inclusive sector and open to everyone. But I'd say that there are perhaps 4 broad pillars of what would constitute a good or ideal data scientist. Now, while no one is ever an expert in everything, I think to be a credible data scientist, you would at least need a reasonable grounding in each of these 4 pillars, albeit you may then, at the individual level, specialize more in one area or another. So these are not in any particular order. I would say treat them broadly as equally weighted, equally important. So a good grounding in mathematics and statistics. Clearly, during your school days, you would have had many years of maths tuition. So your familiarity with maths is likely to be much greater than with statistics. For many students, university programs are perhaps their first exposure to statistics. And hence, at undergraduate level, I see it pretty much every year. Students' performance in mathematics modules always is on average a bit higher than in statistics. And I would say not that statistics is harder, it's a sort of familiarity issue. And perhaps students are more in their comfort zone when studying maths courses because they've had many years of maths tuition. But don't neglect the statistics and a good grounding in sort of probability and distribution theory. I'll just name drop a couple of main areas, what we call supervised learning and unsupervised learning. These are nice, sexy terms, if I may put it that way. How do these differ? They differ in terms of whether or not there is a dependent, apologies for my very poor screen handwriting, is there a clearly defined dependent variable? And if there is, then we are looking at what we call supervised learning. A couple of main areas are what we call regression analysis, when you have what we call a continuous dependent variable. So an example might be stock returns, okay? So for any specific company listed on some stock exchange that perhaps interests you, if you consider not the price of the stock, we don't really care about the price, we care about the change in price over a day, a week, a month, a quarter, a year, whatever your investment time horizon is. So ultimately we care not about the price in period T, but the change with respect to period T-1, and then perhaps express it as a return. So of course, price influences return, but it's not price per se we care about, it's the return R in periods T. So for any stock of interest, your returns will change, and some stocks are riskier than others, some will be more volatile in their price movements. Bitcoin, for example, okay, not a stock, but the price of Bitcoin has been extremely volatile. And depending if one, not that I'm advocating you try and trade or in Bitcoin, but it's been a bit of a roller coaster ride, I'm sure, for those who did. So let's say that's an example of a dependent variable which we seek to explain. And that one we'll treat as sort of a continuous one. The values that a return can take are on a continuous interval. Positive returns, so you're making money, or negative returns, you're losing money. And regression would be a sort of good form for that. If the dependent variable is a categorical variable, for example, in matters of a bank making a lending decision, let's say you've got two types of borrower, those who would default and those who would not default. Okay? Or gosh, in terms of COVID, if one was to take a test for COVID, a diagnostic test, just as you've got the binary classification there, someone defaults on a loan or does not. When someone is tested for COVID, either they do or they do not have COVID at a particular moment in time, and so sort of binary classification. So in this case, we might have a categorical dependent variable and classification through building a model where one classifies a prospective borrower as being either a likely defaulter or non-defaulter, or with some diagnostic test for COVID. Hopefully it correctly classifies someone as having the virus or not. But beware, false positives and false negatives. Just because a test, statistical test, diagnostic test makes a prediction, doesn't necessarily mean it's right. Just briefly on the unsupervised learning, clustering is a major one in trying to identify different, similar groups of people. So let's say a large multinational corporation, MNC, has lots of customers, and while every customer is a unique individual, inevitably some will be similar tastes, preferences, levels of price consciousness, quality consciousness, etc., etc. So in that case, there's not a clearly defined dependent variable, and we can look at what we call dimension reduction techniques, things like clustering for clustering individuals, also principal components analysis, PCA for short, for sort of reducing the number of variables. So good grounding in maths and stats, programming, database management, SQL, I think that was in the top 10 list. Programming languages, Python are useful. I'll now move down here. Communication and visualization, the art of storytelling. Note, stories of fact, not stories of fiction, based on data. Hello?
So I had a question, like, if we do Microsoft Access, isn't it almost the same like SQL? Like, what is the difference between them? Both are databases, like database softwares.
Good question. So if I may expand on that question, if I may, to look at not just database issues, but programming languages, things more generally. If one thinks about a CV, no one is ever going to know everything. Okay, and I mean, I'll come back to the analogy of foreign languages. I mean, just in India alone, I mean, there are probably what, hundreds or thousands of languages, dialects, and while you may speak a few of them, you will never speak all of them. Such that, likewise with your computing skills, one will never know everything. So one shouldn't try and be over ambitious. But in terms of a CV, really what a CV is, I mean, it's historic in that it's looking back at what you have achieved, not just in terms of your computing skills, technical skills, but language skills, work experience, your educational background, so your schools, colleges, universities. But it's all backward looking, it's looking at the past. Now, from a sort of an economist's perspective, one may think of a CV as a form of signaling, looking at the past and effectively when one is applying, let's say, for a job, the reader of the CV is trying to predict what you would be able to achieve in the future. And so from a signaling perspective, the more you can show on your CV, the better, because even if you've acquired skills, some very specialist skills, which are not directly used by that employer. Let's say you learned Python instead of R, for example, or vice versa. The fact that you've learned one shows that you have at least got the aptitude, the capacity, the potential to learn new things. And whenever you start your first job, don't think everything you've learned up to that point will be at the end of your learning. We will very much go into, or we are in, an era of lifelong learning. So I would say other things equal, the more things you are proficient in, the better. However, other things are never equal because there's always the opportunity cost of time. We all face that same major time constraint. You've got 24 hours in a day, each of us. You need to sleep a little bit, eat, relax, a bit of leisure time. But what do you do with the rest of the, however many hours are left in the day? And I would say Microsoft Access, fine. I mean, the more you can put on your CV, the better. But look at you want to maximize your potential. So look very carefully at these top 10 skills on various jobs boards, and that's just by way of example for my top 10 there, and see what skills are demanded by employers now. They may change a bit over time, but not dramatically so, I would say in the next at least 5 years, and make sure that when you're ready to enter the job market, you have a set of skills which would be in demand. Bearing in mind, there would still be perhaps on-the-job training or picking up new skills on a need-to-know basis. So really your CV is a signal of what you've done in the past, and hence that is a signal, albeit an imperfect predictor, because the past is never a perfect predictor of the future, but a good indication about what you could go on and achieve thereafter. On the communication visualization front, so storytelling, we saw communication skills. So it's just clear the mess a second. Look at that, communication skills, number one of the baseline skills, number one. Not necessarily just through data visualization, but by being able to give you oral presentations, written reports, executive summaries, because let's say you do all of this data analysis and you make some data-based discoveries. Chances are you are not going to be the key decision maker in your organization. Who are the decision makers? They will likely be the senior management, okay? Such that while data scientists may be doing things at a very technical level, the people one needs to convince and persuade to take some action based on your analysis are likely to perhaps not be so technically literate. So by being able to explain things, perhaps quite complex concepts in easy to understand terms, that is a great skill. And I think I'd say a skill which is very much lacking, particularly in sort of university curricula. I mean, in my courses, I try and employ some dashboard creation and report writing, because I know that these are useful skills to complement rather than substitute the sort of more techie math stats programming stuff. Tableau, there it is. So the art of storytelling, and then the domain sort of specific knowledge. So are you working in the big pharma sector? Are you working in finance, retail, whatever? And you need a good grounding in the sort of business specific problems, the industry specific problems in which you lie, such that we said there's no shortage of data, but often one is overwhelmed with data and you don't know where to start. And a good data scientist is someone who knows what questions to ask of your data, to know how to interrogate the data. So it's all very well having a lot of theoretical maths and statistics knowledge and being able to build or write your own algorithm. But if you don't know what kind of problem you're trying to solve, you don't know how to get started. So the domain specific stuff, I think, is super important. So just to perhaps pick out a few key ones. Statistics, so depending on where you are in your educational journey, or I'm not sure if you've started university yet, or you're just about to apply. Not saying to do a pure degree in statistics, but you want to at least take some statistics courses. Having a good grounding in sort of probability and distribution theory, very, very helpful. Note, I'm not saying exclusively, this is part of the package that you're trying to create and offer employers. Communication skills, very, very key message, programming, industry-specific knowledge. At the university level, inevitably, there is a natural sequencing here. If one aspired, I aspire, it should be you aspire. If one aspires, not person specific, if one aspires to a PhD, typically one has to do an MSc first, and in order to do an MSc, one has to do a BSc. So there's a sort of natural order of progression. Is the PhD necessary? Most people with PhDs will tend to do so in most subject areas, will tend to do so to remain in academia. However, if you have a more quantitative oriented PhD, of course, there are numerous opportunities in the private sector. Now, but what matters to you? I've made a career out of teaching. It's not minimum wage, but I'm sure I could have a few more zeros on my pay if I worked in full-time in the private sector. But your money isn't everything. And I think best piece of careers advice is to do what you enjoy, do what you love, okay? Because if you have a job that you love, it's not work. I don't view what I do every day as work. I just view it as a sort of hobby. It's something I enjoy to do. And then effectively you're never meant to work a day in your life if you do what you love. An inquiring mind, thinking about how to solve problems. And sorry, there was one in the top 10 somewhere there. It was number 4, problem solving. Being able to think outside the proverbial box. And I think this is where a lot of higher education, somewhat generalized, perhaps doesn't prepare students terribly well for in the real world, is that often if I give a student a quantitative problem, they want to know what the answer is. Now, for some problems, there is a single right answer, and you've got like a structured problem and a clearly defined question with a single right answer. But in much of life, problems are sort of unstructured in that there's not necessarily a ready-made textbook solution or an off-the-shelf solution. And being able to either individually or more likely collaboratively, being able to work in teams, and I think to the organizational skills, I think it matters matters a great deal, and thinking about how to approach a problem. And sometimes one needs a degree of intuition to solve problems, which I'd like to think, a focus on sort of statistics, because it can be often counterintuitive. A lot of the sort of probability results, I think, assists with that development of intuition and ultimately the inquiring mind. Just a bit of name dropping of LSE. Like all great universities, we have a crest, a logo, and a motto. And I guess the really elite ones have a motto in Latin. Now, please forgive any poor Latin pronunciation. I did it but many years ago. Rerum cognoscere causas, to understand the causes of things. Okay? And LSE itself, this was, we were founded back in 1895. We had our 125th birthday last year, but those celebrations were all online only. But we were set up to have a better understanding of the causes of things. But this links, I think, very nicely to, if I may go back, under our supervised learning. So I said there's a clearly defined dependent variable, e.g. the returns of a stock. So what's driving those changes in returns? What's driving the change in the price of and ultimately returns of investments in Bitcoin or Apple stock, Amazon stock, or whatever? And inevitably, there's likely going to be a whole host of factors. such that regression techniques offer one way of trying to ascertain what the cause is, the cause is of variation in a variable might be. Now, this is the plural causes, such that when, as a starting point, we may seek to understand changes in data sets. So, e.g., the change in price and returns of a stock or Bitcoin or whatever. Now, of course, understanding is helpful, but we may also wish to go beyond that and do a form of prediction. We can look at the past and try and understand the past, but ultimately we care about not what's happened, but what is going to happen in the future. Now, whether that's the near future or the distant future, it's somewhat subjective of time horizons. But we may wish to ultimately build some kind of predictive models. Late great Albert Einstein, I love this quote. This comes back to the communication skills, the art of storytelling. And please do not neglect this very important aspect. If you are unable to communicate your results well, doesn't matter how wonderful your analysis was, it's probably all for nothing if you cannot convey to people what you have discovered and hence what kinds of decisions you would advocate being made as a consequence. So if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. Top tip, anticipating you will have exams in the future, just as you had in the past, and you're doing your revision ahead of exams. At what point have you done enough revision in any subject area? And I think a good litmus test of this is to perhaps you speak to a family member, someone who does not know the specific subject you are about to take an exam in, and sit them down and try and explain some key concept of that course to someone who knows nothing of that subject area. And if you can explain it such that they can understand and avoid technical details, but to really explain to like a 10-year-old child what one concept really meant. And if they can understand after you've done the explanation, I think that is a very good hallmark of whether you yourself have sufficiently understood it, and hence whether you are ready for the examination. So some pros and cons. So the world is ever changing. The labor market has forever been changing, and it will change again in the future. You will hear about, no doubt, a lot of job automation. Okay, now is this good or bad? It depends. If you are aspiring to a career in a sector which is with high probability going to be automated in the next 5 to 10 years, then perhaps you are going to encounter some problems. Whereas if you prepare for jobs which are not at high risk of automation, and I'd say, while computers can do a lot of automated number crunching, we still need human beings for the foreseeable future to make sense of the calculations and the output of these calculations. Computers are great at sort of following instructions and programs we build for them to run, but I'd say computers don't really yet have human common sense, and I don't see them having that in the near future. So human beings can add great value by offering sort of reality checks of answers. There's a huge danger of sort of spurious results. Red flags are raised by a computer. It's found some relationship between X and Y, but maybe that's simply by chance, and it's a sort of spurious result. In the fields of data science, don't take it from me, go to perhaps LinkedIn if you're on that and just do some job search on there. Type in some of those keywords I've mentioned, Tableau, visualization, programming, statistics, and see, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by not just the number of job postings, whether it's in India, UK, or anywhere else in the world, but also the variety of sectors where you can find these opportunities, private sector, public sector. And demand very much exceeds supply. There's this sort of skills deficit. And if you've ever done any economics, Econ 101, if you're looking at supply and demand, when the demand exceeds supply, the price goes up. Well, in the job market, when the demand for people of a certain type with a certain set of skills exceeds supply, the price goes up. But the price we're talking about is the salary that you would earn. And of course, this is only helping to put upward pressure on salaries, which of course is good for you. It's been estimated as various management consultancies, they churn out these reports periodically about predictions of the jobs of the future in 5 years, 10 years from now. It could well be, well, I think, was it, I forget which consultancy it was, but something like, there was a report that said something like 10% of the jobs in like 5 years time don't yet exist. Okay. So while there's this creative destruction, some jobs will get destroyed or replaced through automation. However, while some jobs are going to be destroyed, new jobs are going to be created. And it could well be that your first job, and when you're looking for that first job, if it's 3 or 4 years into the future, maybe that job role, that job title doesn't yet exist. It's quite exciting. But nonetheless, I think these are a lot of the skills, if I'm not giving specific job titles, these will be skills required, I think, in many of these data science based careers. Quant subjects, maths, stats, there's a perception that these can be quite hard or challenging. Now, the fact that you're tuning into this session, I would, one might anticipate a sort of self-selection bias. You perhaps have some interest in data science to sit in on a 1-hour data science session. But I would say, while at the general humanity level, maybe there's an aversion to numbers, and people have as almost like a badge of honor. I'm bad at maths, and I'm proud of that. I'd say it's not hard, but depending on how people were taught in the early stages of their schooling, if they were taught a lot of abstract algebra or geometry, detached from reality, and perhaps people couldn't see the point of these studies, perhaps. But I'd say it's not hard, provided one perseveres and practices. I think anyone can, with sufficient effort, can master these things. Programming languages, as I said, the more you can demonstrate some proficiency of, the better. You can't know everything. Your CV is signaling, and then perhaps you self-certify what level of proficiency you claim to have achieved. Sectors to work in, wide-ranging. Do the LinkedIn or other jobs board search and just get a sense of what is out there. Okay, conscious of time, so I'll try and leave some time for Q&A. Just a few suggested job title roles. Admittedly, of those different pillars of the maths and stats, the programming, the communication skills, the domain-specific skills, some of these will specialize more in one area than the other. So data engineer, database management, focusing more perhaps on sort of the programming database skills, understandably. Data journalism, gosh, I mean, the pandemic, and not to detract from the health and economic effects of COVID, but from a pure statistical perspective, I think the demand from the media for, shall we say, statistical commentary at the global level, I think has been really at an all-time high. I'm sure you've all seen COVID charts, whether for India specifically or the wider world. And there's been a great increase in the use, and thankfully a great use of sort of visualizations in data journalism. The Economist, for example, they've got a very good data visualization unit, and it's nice to see how they have used data to assist in storytelling. So a few sort of suggested areas, just a couple of examples about sort of prediction. As I say, we have data on the past, but our interest is not historic. It's always forward-looking, what's going to happen next. So and we can never predict perfectly. So any prediction really should come with a probability estimate associated with it. So just to give a sense of areas, I've mentioned sort of defaulting on a loan sort of previously. So a bank manager, a prospective borrower says, I need a loan for something or other. And the bank manager has to make a decision to lend or not to lend. And really what the bank manager wants to know is, if I lend this person the money, will I get that money back? And presumably with some interest in compensation. Now, the prospective borrower says, yes, I intend to repay, and they may well intend to, but they can't be certain they will. Maybe they lose their job, or there's some financial catastrophe and they borrow the money and have every intention of repaying, but sadly were unable to. So the risk of someone defaulting on a mortgage in medical situations. I mean, here in the UK, and I suspect worldwide, here in the UK, I mean, hospitals have been preoccupied with COVID, understandably, for the last nearly 18 months. All other sort of non-urgent medical operations have been put on a waiting list. Here, there's a 4 or 5 year backlog, I think, of people requiring surgery, waiting list. So when you start to try and clear that backlog, in what order are you going to treat people? Well, I think it has to be done on a sort of risk-assessed basis. Who is at most urgent need, or longer term, preemptively anticipate who may be at greater risk of developing heart disease, cancer, whatever, and perhaps try and predict this in advance, preempt it, and intervene before the health condition escalates. One I left down here. Top tip for you, a film recommendation. Okay, if you like Tom Cruise, okay, the Mission Impossible series. Well, I'm not asking you to watch the Mission Impossible series, but back in 2001, I think, he's been around for some time now. Tom Cruise did a film called Minority Report. Okay, now I'm not asking you necessarily to watch the whole film, but at least perhaps on YouTube, watch the trailer. Okay, and it was science fiction in 2001, arguably still science fiction now, but maybe science fact in the years ahead. And it's about trying to predict crime. And it was sort of set in the back then, but in the future, to look at pre-crime, to try and predict in advance who was going to perhaps commit a murder, and then the police would intervene and prevent that murder from ever taking place. But of course, this means making predictions, and predictions can be wrong. So it's just a 2 or 3 minute trailer on YouTube, and listen out for the phrase false positives, which is actually mentioned in the sort of official trailer. Not spoken by Tom Cruise, but I think Colin Farrell, I mean, one of the other actors. Such that in matters of prediction of crime or COVID testing, the dangers of false positives and also the dangers of false negatives. Very, very briefly, be running, but big data, you'll hear this phrase, if not already, a lot more in the future. Lots of definitions, we could advocate for it. I'll summarize as perhaps the 5 V's, officially 4 V's, but I like to add in a 5th. Volume, do you have one humongous data set, or is it lots of small data sets merged into one whole? Variety, data come in many different forms. Sentiment analysis, scraping social media posts to gain a sense about people's views, positive or negative, on all sorts of issues. Data are not necessarily nicely clean and structured to immediately permit analysis. You've got to do a lot of data wrangling, data cleaning ahead of any actual analysis. Velocity, the speed at which it's generated. Value, is data the new oil? There's a lot of noise in most data sets that you would get, and we need to refine it and extract the signal from the noise. And my favorite one, vanity. Okay. Beware spurious correlations. This is my favorite example. Such that computers are great and you can program them to find relationships between variables. However, we always need a reality check, some common sense check of output to see whether something is genuinely a relationship. So I don't know how clear it is on screen, but you can hopefully see a red and yellow lines, and they track each other almost perfectly. Such that if I sort a correlation, broadly a correlation between -1 and +1, and the closer it is to -1 or +1, the stronger that relationship. So with a simple calculation, that would indicate a very strong relationship between the red and the yellow lines. Okay. However, what are the red and the yellow lines? The yellow one, total revenue generated by US skiing facilities. Okay. And over that 10-year period, you can see the upward trend. In red, okay, number of people who died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. Okay. Now, if the one thing to take away from this session is that changing your bed sheets can be deadly. And amazingly, some people actually die just by changing their bed sheets because they get tangled up in them. I think this data was from the US, but these are not isolated cases. Hundreds of people per year in America get killed just by changing their bed sheets because they somehow get tangled up and get suffocated. So if you were ever asked by a parent to change your bed, offer them this evidence and say, look, I'm not putting myself at risk, I need assistance, and don't let it be a single person job. So spurious relationships, they exist. And so we always need to do decent reality checks of answers and do they seem reasonable? Almost some classification. Looking at this sort of supervised, unsupervised learning. Let's say you're trying to predict a couple of groups, you defaulters versus non-defaulters, for example. And you try to find some predictor variables, nominally X1 and X2. And then effectively do a kind of clustering of them in that these ones have a similar profile. If this was income and age, these are low income, but fairly variable in terms of their ages. And maybe these indicate defaulters on a loan. The twos over here tend to be quite high income, but variable in age. Then we got this sort of gray area whereby it's very hard to distinguish one type of person from another. So in matters of classification, sometimes it's very easy to classify and we can do so with great confidence and with high probability that we're right. But we'll also have those gray areas where it's very hard to distinguish one individual from another. So those sorts of techniques of what you would cover in some sort of statistical courses. And this final example, clustering. Unsupervised learning, looking for homogeneous, similar groups, e.g. of consumers. So if this was importance of price and quality, perhaps as two variables when you're buying some product, like coffee, for example. There's obviously in India they got this coffee chain. Is it Happy Coffee? No, Coffee Day Coffee. Oh, I forgot that very big coffee chain in India. And then let's say if you're buying coffee, what matters to you, the price or the quality, or maybe both? And then we're looking for similar minded or similar preference individuals and look for sort of different sort of market segments, for example. Now, this case is pretty easy. You've got 4 distinct groups such that within a group, they exhibit similar characteristics. Trouble is, the real world is messier and people don't always necessarily nicely be assigned to one specific group or another. And then it gets quite challenging to do this sort of grouping, but we can apply some unsupervised learning techniques to assist us with it. Final thing, and then sorry, we will quickly go to any quick Q&A. Sorry, one piece of one recommendation. I mentioned Tableau. Okay, now I'm not I don't belong to Tableau, so this is not a commercial endorsement of them. But if you just go to Google or any search engine you like, if you just do Tableau for Students, okay, and get the Tableau for Students link, if you have a school or university email account such that you can verify your student status, okay, then you can get for free a fully licensed student version of Tableau. If you do not have a way of verifying your student status, then you can at least get, I think, a 14-day free version, and then it expires. And we saw Tableau for the storytelling, it featured on the in-demand skills. It's completely free, lots of training videos, screencasts that you can sort of educate yourselves with. So it's a nice thing, and if you've not seen it before, it's something you can have a play with and add on to your CV. And I think that would impress anyone who would read your CV. Okay, well, I'm sorry, I probably overshot on time, and so the moderator will probably kill me. But nonetheless, those were my 2 or 3 cents or rupees on sort of the field of data science.
Right. Thank you so very much, Dr. James. I mean, it was wonderful to have you. I'm sure students have learned a lot from your experience, and they are going to take all the learnings back and perhaps, get back to you with a lot of incredible questions, because trust me, I mean, these students have a lot of interesting questions to ask. I want to very quickly add a note, and as you may already know, that COVID-19 is making people and organizations think very differently about the world and do things very differently. And obviously, ISBF, LSE, we all are no exception to that. And as a token of appreciation, we would like to extend a thank you voucher from an apparel startup founded by ISBF students. The name of the startup is Emacity, and it is a startup which desires to contribute towards living sustainably by enabling responsible consumption in the irresponsible era of fast fashion. So once again, that's just a token of appreciation from our side. Thank you so very much for joining us here today, and we'll definitely get back to you if the students have questions. Thank you.
A pleasure. Well, stay safe and healthy, everyone. And I wish you all the best for your careers of the future. Remember that it's an era of lifelong learning, and when you finish your formal educational journey, don't think that's the end of your learning. So continue to reskill and upskill, and make sure that you possess skill sets which are in demand. And if you do that, I think the probability you have very successful careers is exceptionally high.